Thanks, Patty. My name is Susan Henderson. My firm is PlaceMakers, and we will be hosting a dance party, which is on the agenda. Now, one little caveat I should mention prior to talking about coding and zoning is there's limited capacity at the venue this year for the dance party, and you should know that. And if you want to get in, you should come between 9:30 and 10 because it's also, the venue itself is open to the public, even though we have a part of it reserved for CNU. And once the fire marshal evidently stands guard, and once it fills up, it's filled. So come early. And with that, let me say this about this session. I can't imagine that this many people are in the room voluntarily. Coding and zoning has a very limited audience unless you get that letter in your mailbox that says you're being rezoned. And normally it's probably one of the drier topics in the planning profession. However, it's also one of the more powerful. A few years ago, Kate Benfield, another one of the PlaceMakers partners, and myself had a conversation about why zoning. And for me as an architect, for years I worked for Steve Mouzon, who's probably one of the more talented architects in the CNU and are maybe even around. But we did some phenomenal work as architects, but the thing that I slowly began to realize is that so much of what shapes the urban fabric and the buildings themselves even is actually the zoning. And as we try to encourage through CNU compact, convivial, complex, mixed-use, walkable communities, and especially like Kate and I have a passion for the neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood, and the way you get that right, at least the way you enable it, is through zoning. So zoning can, once you get into that headspace of how can I creatively enable the type of character that we're trying to produce in our neighborhood or in our town or in our city, then zoning suddenly becomes sexy, whereas otherwise it's painfully boring. So anyway, all of you must have already reached that epiphany because I've never seen this many people interested in a zoning session. So here's a little housekeeping we just have to do for the record. This session is eligible for AIA and APA learning units, and that's the name of it. And this says that AIA does not endorse nor approve necessarily. It's a disclaimer. Here's the session description that you probably read to get here. And here are the learning objectives, which if you want to know what they are, I'll email them to you. What is the issue really at hand? And this is something that CNU has become very passionate about in the last few years, although it's been an ongoing project probably for about 30 years via the work DPZ initiated at Seaside. And the problem really is that all of our enabling legislation is written for suburban development. Everything from signage to public works, zoning, subdivision regulations, everything is written to produce suburbia in the vast majority of American cities. And so really the goal of CNU is just to level the playing field, just to make the good stuff legal. Would love to mandate it, to require it, but rarely is there that sort of political will, except perhaps in city centers or in really robust historic neighborhoods. Those usually have more initiative and more desire to protect the character of place. But on the edges and in suburbia, where we're trying to do all the things that I'm sure Kate talked about this morning, about what is sustainable, how do we green our neighborhoods and our streets, and how do we make them environmentally responsible. All of those things really have to be done incrementally, and usually the baby step is just making it legal, long before you get around to actually requiring it. So the first thing that I alluded to before is really what is the scope. Now the description talked about zoning, and we've been working on zoning, really like I mentioned before, DPZ originated the whole notion of form-based codes about 30 years ago, and it's been an evolving process, and the Form-Based Codes Institute has been very, very involved in moving that conversation forward. And we're seeing many codes now that are addressing at the zoning level what's necessary, but the scope is bigger than that. Like I mentioned before, we have to deal with things like subdivision regulations. And because many of the issues controlling lot configuration and right-of-way widths and those sorts of things that contribute to the urban character, all of those are done at the subdivision regulation scale. And then even more importantly is a project that Steve and I both have been assisting Andres with for a while, which is public works. And we'll get into that in more detail in a little bit. But this particular slide shows you, this is, if this works. No? All right, let's try another one. This is where we are right here. And what's interesting is this is business 4. It's kind of a general business district. And it actually has 2 different overlay zones on top of it. And so what you normally get at the zoning level, even for a place as rich and beautiful as downtown Detroit and very, very urban, what you get at a zoning level is a whole lot of information that may be difficult to actually result in buildings like this being done today. I was in a lean code workshop this morning, and the Detroit Planning Commission Director of Zoning was telling us about the history of the zoning code in Detroit, and even though their planning commission was established in 1918, really one of the earliest in the country, and their Euclidean code was like completely fleshed out in the early 40s. But what they have today is the zoning ordinance that is like 800 and some odd pages. And so to be able to find your way through that maze, to do something good at the lot level in downtown, I can't imagine what that's like. And so the zoning it has the biggest image on the page, and it's the thing we'll talk about the most. But also, this is these are the subdivision regulations from Detroit, which you can't read. But they're usually in many municipalities, they're much more compact, but they control some really critical items, largely the issue of platting, which when we think of the difference in the historic battles that have happened over the last few years regarding big boxes, platting is critical when you think about lot size. And what most I won't jump ahead, sorry. And then finally, public works may be the biggest issue. A few years ago, John Massengale and Victor Dover wrote a book on really what is the art of the street and how do we make that truly the public realm and the place where people congregate, and how do we make those active? And so all of that sort of data is regulated, of course, usually in public works. In smaller cities, that also finds its way into subdivision regulations. Like I said, guys, this is going to be boring. But it's all critically important when you're trying to craft a character-rich and appropriate place. And whether you're doing that through redevelopment, like here in Detroit, whether you're doing it through contraction, like many of the Rust Belt cities are facing, and how do we redevelop and infill our historic places? Maybe the block structure is right, and maybe the streets are right, and then at that point, it's an issue of zoning. So this is the scope for today, and we're gonna try to cover all 3 of these topics. I should also mention that I want to allow ample time at the end for conversation, because that's usually where the best part of the session happens. So I'll try to be brief while still covering a decent amount of information. So then there's an elephant in the room. And Lynn Richards, our CEO, brings this up quite a bit, that is something that we've been kind of circling for a long time, and a lot of the folks who are working here with the small developer workshops, they're finding workarounds for this, but it's something I'm not going to address today, and that is the building code, which it is the thing that can still, you get all the rest of it right, and this still can be a huge barrier to good urbanism. And it's something I think CNU is slowly beginning to take on. Different members of CNU have been very interested in it and dealing with it. But as far as the movement embracing the International Codes Council, that's a pretty big elephant. And it's something that hopefully we will begin to address as we move forward. So what are the solutions to all of this? Well, the first issue under zoning, as I mentioned, it has had a lot of attention, and a lot of members of our organization have been working on it collectively and independently for a long time. Probably the biggest single institutional body is the Form-Based Codes Institute, and they have a great resource. There's a library of codes on their website. I highly recommend you check it out. And so what I'm going to start off with is a brief introduction of what form-based codes consist of, and I apologize in advance if this is like way too elementary for the majority of you, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, in my opinion, there are two major differences between a form-based code and a Euclidean ordinance, and it's purpose and priorities. And so the purpose of a form-based code is really, it's about implementing community. How do you write the rules that result in true community? Steve, did you take this picture? Okay, so Steve Mazzana is the photographer of this image, and this is a new community right outside of Montgomery, Alabama. This was probably 6 or 8 years ago, but it's completely unstaged. It's not a marketing shot. It's just what happened. And it's how you design the front of the building, the sidewalk, and the open space, and how those operate as a composition that set the stage for community. And these are just random neighbors that show up there. They play checkers, they eat lunch, they have evening cocktails, and it's the place where they gather in that community. And if you don't write the rules in a way that requires, or at least enables, these sorts of places, then we all live in our little pods and we disappear behind our garage doors and we never engage with our neighbors. So that is in fact the Euclidean purpose. It originated, as you probably know, with the whole issue post-industrial. You know, our cities became so industrialized, and at that time it was dirty industry, and so it was about separating largely residential from industrial. And I took this image a few years ago flying into Las Vegas, and what I find interesting about it is, you know, the difference in the density and the building size of the multifamily, the difference in the lot size and the building size of the 3 different residential neighborhoods, and then of course the big box pad sites at this junction of 2 major arterials. So what we see in the majority of zoning at the Euclidean scale is this minutia of difference in which, you know, range, in fact I'll show you that in a moment, but ranges of density that are different zoning regulations, and differences of commercial that are all segregated from one another. And so when we get into that degree of segregation, there's a great image, I think by Tom Lowe of DBZ, that shows when you have all of these things separated, then it overloads, of course, our dendritic thoroughfare system. And then the arterials, of course, have to get wider and wider to manage the capacity that's required to get from one use to the other. So The other big difference between these two systems is priorities. Now, they both exactly control the same things. There's many people that actually have this presumption that form-based codes don't deal with use. That's not true. Form-based codes absolutely deal with use, but they are second, or some people even say third in the list of priorities. And this is my list. Other people put management as number 2. But this is a great image from the Grass Valley Code by Opticos. And the thing that you see in a form-based code is that the majority of the pages, the length of the document, and the degree of detail of the content is associated with the form of the building. And it's not style. It has nothing to do with really architectural regulations. Of course, that's not permitted under zoning in most states. But really what it has to do is with how the building meets the street. So you'll see most of these zoning codes have extensive details about what we call the frontage. It's what happens between the front face of the building and the lot line. And that is the place where you define character. I remember an experience that I had a number of years ago now where we had been given the job of doing a form-based code for Taos, New Mexico. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Taos, but it's a stunning little Spanish colonial hamlet in northern New Mexico in the mountains. And it is the most organic settlement, I think, that I've seen in the United States. And the cranky streets, the tiny little right-of-ways, carriageways, you know, the itsy-bitsy sidewalks that normally we would poo-poo, but they work there. And in desperation, because normally in zoning, it's very clear to be able to define character zones and have, you know, a very small range that's appropriate in each zone as we do form-based codes. But I just couldn't see how that would work there, because in their, what we call T5, or their urban center, they had 0 lot lines and they had 24-foot setbacks with front courtyards. And there was this huge range that all contributed to the charm of sort of that organic character. And Andres was very generous with his time, and I called him and, you know, was sort of frantic about how do you code this without destroying it. And his response was, it's all about the frontage. If you are very explicit about about the nuances of the frontage and the difference in types of frontage, then you can make it work. And that's what we found to be true, and we'll get into that in more detail in a moment about that is one explicit type of form-based code. So the form-based code priorities, okay, we already went through this, and the Euclidean priorities are really the same, that the topics are the same, they're just reversed. And like I mentioned before, this is a town that shall remain nameless, a small town in near Madison, Wisconsin, that their list of different types, well, that one clicked too, the different types of residential alone, you know, it's just ridiculous. Especially for a relatively small place. And so that's what we see in most places we work, that in an attempt to sterilize the environment, frankly, and I'm sorry, but a lot of this resulted, you know, pre-civil rights era when there was white flight and people trying to insulate themselves, you know, reducing diversity rather than increasing diversity. And it was mind-numbing control of separation. And so that is the primary Euclidean priority is use. And then they do deal with form. There are height issues regulated, there are always setbacks that are regulated. But in general, those are tertiary to the other two being management and use. So I will go through a list of types of form-based codes because there's not a one-size-fits-all. There are different contexts, you have different goals for where you're working, and therefore there are different solutions, and they're all good, they just have different locations in which you use them. The most common one, I think, Hazel Boris was saying this morning, she does the code study with Emily Talon, and I think she said that over 75% of the codes the form-based codes that have been adopted are transect-based on some level. And you may be familiar with this DPZ illustration from a few years ago about the natural transect. And so it's an organizing structure that environmentalists use to assess flora and fauna in a specific area. And that is something then that Andres had this idea a few years ago that you can apply that to the urban environment. And so from the most rural or natural through suburban, general neighborhood, and urban center, and then urban core, there's very different character and actually, frankly, different people that live in each of those zones. I'm T4, T5 in my preferences. My husband is T1, T2, so that's a bit of a problem. But you know, everyone is most comfortable and flourishes the most in a specific sort of environment. When you're looking for a new home, you naturally gravitate to a specific kind of neighborhood. And that's what the transect is all about. It's about really that there's a place for everything, but just making sure that every environment is immersive. And this is used, it is the organizing structure, the framework for the only model form-based code that's out there right now, and this is freeware. It is called the SmartCode, and you can find it if you want to download a version, if you want to use it at home. You can download it from transect.org. I will warn you about this, though. It's not one of those things that you just do casually. We've actually worked in places in the code. There's in green text is everything that you must calibrate. We have been hired to work in places where they adopted one of these codes and everything was still in green. So you have to, you know, I would caution you to do a lot of self-education before you just try to use it off the shelf. It's usually inappropriate. I believe Andres says that this code will produce a good sort of upper Midwestern American city. But if you're in Kona, Hawaii, that's not very appropriate. So, you know, you have to get the calibration right. You have to get the frontages right, the densities right, the block structure right. All of those things need to be done locally. And so it's a good framework. It's a great starting point. But that is what it is. Another very common type I alluded to, or I mentioned before, was frontages. And probably some of the best known of these is the Columbia Pike, right? And also Hercules. These were both done by Farrell Madden and Associates. And as you notice here, this is what's called the regulating plan. But the area that is highlighted both in red or in blue, that really is the only area that's controlled by regulation. It essentially is saying what we care about is from front of building to front of building. Now they do control heights with this as well, but the bulk of the regulations are associated directly with the frontage. And we see this used frequently in a corridor redevelopment. I don't know how many of you have visited Columbia Pike. It's been a phenomenal success as a redevelopment story. And it works really very well in those areas because usually then the intact, stable neighborhoods that are behind the corridors are not impacted by it. So if you're trying to add nodes, add intensity, or correct do a suburban retrofit situation, this is a very good solution. Another type is the thoroughfare code. And this is the Hercules plan that was done by Dover Cullen Partners. in California. And it's very similar to the frontage type, but what it does is it codifies based on what kind of street you're attached to. So the heights on, and there's a lot of sophistication associated with this because, for example, if you're on a wider mixed use, like a commercial street, you have a larger right-of-way, and therefore your buildings can be taller to get the sense of enclosure right. And if you're on a smaller right-of-way, a quieter neighborhood street, a yield street, then the building heights are much lower because you already have a less of a width. So there's a lot of ways in which form-based codes have subtle connections to one regulation has a connection and an impact on another one. For example, in the SmartCode, it controls lot width rather than lot size because it also controls block perimeter. So with those two things combined with each other, you're essentially controlling the lot size. So there's no need in doing a redundancy. So the more, I have to tell you this too, I don't know how many codes I've written now, and a lot of them have been based on the SmartCode. And it probably was the first 15 or 20 codes I wrote before I quit having a, wow, that's how that works moment. It's just, there's so many very sophisticated nuances attached to how all of the things are interrelated that, if you can tolerate a good code read, if you have sleep disorder issues, do it at bedtime. And it really is amazing how much you can keep learning every time you read it or every time you try to use it. Then another type, now this is a type in and of itself. It's commonly used by architects who understand that if you do a great plan, that it's always the architects that destroy it when it goes vertical. So architects who, and I can say this because I am one, but we tend to be control freaks and we want everyone to do things in our way, and it's all about the beauty. So, we like to regulate at the building scale. And now this is a great tool for historic neighborhoods, places that have historic preservation in place, because then you can be very nuanced. It actually can replace your design guidelines. And actually a number of codes, you'll see it very commonly in a lot of the codes in Southern California, a number of codes actually use the building type regulations on top of some other system like character zones or transect zones. So it can either be a standalone type itself, or it can be an additional layer of detail or regulation that's added to some other base type. This is the Beaufort County, South Carolina code by Opticos. And I think you'll see it, the other one that I think is very beautifully done is the Santa Ana downtown code by Mal Palazoides. So if you want to check those out, they're really good types of this. So now form-based codes, as I mentioned, that's the goal. I mean, really, that is the best way to assure good urbanism and character-rich urbanism. However, there are interventions that are possible. And there's a movement now, in fact, I'll show you a slide in a minute, but tomorrow morning I would recommend, if you're interested, there's a forum on the Project for Code Reform. And it's like, the question is going to be, what are the baby steps? What are the incremental steps? If a place doesn't have existing capacity to do a form-based code, what can we do? And maybe that's something that you can deal with in whether you're on the private side or public side, maybe that's something you can begin to affect at home immediately. So I'm going to tell you about the Nashville story. Last year, Rick Bernhardt was with us. He has since retired. He was a planning director in Nashville, Tennessee, and he was responsible for 20 some odd neighborhood-based, form-based codes in his tenure that resulted in billions of dollars worth of new construction. And all of this is at the infill scale. So that's a lot of money. But Rick told us he had a very reticent council and mayor and a very skeptical development community. So what he did is he began with two things. He said, number one, parking goes on the street or behind the building, no parking lots in front. And number two, instead of just having setbacks, we're also going to have build two lines. So when you're in an urban context, you must build within the first, whatever it was for that location, say the first 6 to 8 feet of the property line. And so they began to see almost immediately at different scales, because he applied different standards across the transect, but he began to see almost immediately, the development community began to see, wow, this works. You know, it builds value, we can lease it faster, we have higher lease rates, and they began themselves then to request it. So anecdotally, we recently did a code in the region in Williamson County, and I think it's the first time ever I went for an interview, and one of the planning commission members asked us, well, he basically said, we must have a transect-based code. And it's like, hello? You know, usually it takes us months of public outreach to get people to the point of understanding the concept of the transect. And so the work that Rick did in Nashville has been so regionally pervasive that that is what the local builders and developers are wanting to do, because they understand the economic value of it. So Rick began with the baby steps. He began incrementally, and it resulted in a paradigm shift, not only in Nashville, but in the entire region. So don't belittle the concept of doing something small to begin with, because it can have tremendous long-range impact on your community. Now, this is another thing that is just being released here at CNU, and there is a project for lean urbanism that has been going on for the last few years, and it really began here in Detroit a few years ago. And it's been funded by the Nike Foundation, and they just recently asked us to build this tool. So Matt Lambert from DPZ and myself just released this. And it is a small publication that talks about the strategies that you can use once you assess what your local capacity is. And maybe that is cell designations. Maybe it's something tiny. You know, maybe it is truly a baby step. But you have to assess not only what the political will is in your community, you know, how much support do you have for this at large, but also, frankly, the other big issue is what is your staff capacity? Because I was just talking to a former client this morning who's here, and one of the issues in this job that actually became a real barrier to implementation was, frankly, she was the only person on the entire staff that had a clue as to how to implement the code. So you really have to be able to assess what your staff can do and gauge your coding interventions appropriate to their capacity. So I recommend you to download this. I know you can't read that, and it's way too many letters, but if you want to know, if you want a link to it, email me, and I will be glad to send it to you. It is available as an EPUB, and it's also on Blurb, so if you need a hard copy. So basically, like I just mentioned, you go through and you assess where you are in your level of capacity. There's a checklist, there's a series of questions that help you do your own internal assessment. You know, and I just have to say, the one caveat is most of us think we can do more than we really can. So be painfully honest about it. There's nothing wrong with being small. And if you understand that you are small, then you can actually choose implementable strategies as opposed to biting off something that never gets implemented. The other organizing system for this tool is that there are different solutions for infill versus sprawl repair. Like, for example, what you do here in downtown is one series of interventions. Last night we were up in Corktown on this horrible arterial. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. I think it was, yeah. And we had drinks one place and we tried to go across the street to eat dinner at another place. And crossing this thing mid-block with no crosswalks, I don't think there were crosswalks anywhere, but I mean, it was taking your life into your own hands. Someone said you could build a whole row houses in the center turn lane. I mean, it's just a mammoth road. So what you do in a place like that is a whole different set of strategies. So that's one thing that this tool does, is it identifies the difference based on what your context is. And then finally, because it is, the mandate is that it's lean, it addresses the issues, the barriers that you're trying to overcome, whether it's regulatory, which is the most common one, financial, which of course is a real issue in places like Detroit, and then issues of walkability, which almost all of us need to be addressing where we live. So to wrap up the codes part of this, I just want to mention the sessions here at CNU. I'm really pleased with the number of sessions that are being offered. In the morning is that 4-hour project for code reform, and just to let you know, this is going to be more of a dialogue. It's, as Lynn Richards says, there's 75,000 units of local government, and we're in like 350 of them with zoning reform. And so how do we build the capacity internally to really affect that many local governments? And then at 12:30, the Form-Based Codes Institute is having a panel discussion on implementing form-based codes in your community. At the same time, there's another session, I think, by Karen Perolik on how do we nuance the transect? Just 6 very clear different zones don't necessarily work in every place. So how do you fine-tune that to work in your local community? And then in the evening, there's kind of one of those special sessions that's kind of off the record that John Anderson is doing, which is how to hack the codes. And you know, it's the workarounds. How do you deal with problems that are enabling suburbia when you're really trying to do good urbanism? And I think John's going to deal a lot with issues to do with the dreaded IBC as well. So that is something you probably want to attend. Then on Saturday morning, we'll be talking at great length. There's a plenary on lean urbanism, and I think Matt Lambert will be showing this lean code tool, and then an open innovation session at 11:15. So there's a lot of opportunities. If you're a code nerd, which, you know, honestly, I can't believe that many of you are here. But if you truly are interested in zoning reform locally, there are a lot of opportunities here at CNU to get further into the weeds, or come tag one of us weirdos. So the next thing is subdivision. And as I mentioned before, if you don't get the platting right, then the zoning of the parcel can never be ideal. And so there's a real art to this. Last year, Ellen Dunham-Jones sponsored a session, she organized a panel session on the art of platting. And so it's really interesting once you get into the beautiful old plats. I'll show you one in a minute of Detroit, some exquisite platting of our historic cities. But Euclidean, like I mentioned earlier, standard subdivision regulations now are usually about lot size, and it's very similar to an FAR problem in that if you just say the total number of square feet, how that gets assembled, and whether or not it's a flag lot or how wide it is, you have very little control over that if your single setting is square footage. So what most form-based codes do instead, and they wind up putting it into zoning, is they control lot width. Because if you realize the places that you love the most, for example, the really lovely fine grain of the couple blocks in Greektown or some of the areas here in downtown, usually those smaller segments of buildings, those are the ones that are very appealing, both not only aesthetically and socially to us as human beings, but also economically. It's a great incubator for local business. It's a place where you can own the entire thing and subsidize your mortgage as a live-work, for example. So being able to permit the very narrow lot is critically important in urban planning. And the other big thing that's really important to remember is platting flexibility. Now, usually in Euclidean ordinances, there is no flexibility. It's a single size minimum, and that's it. Now, in most form-based codes, you will find that the lot width has a range. It's from X to Y.